Do you see that dust cloud in the distance? Captain, Lieutenant Mason asked, lowering his binoculars. Captain Daniel Mackenzie squinted at the barren horizon of Western Australia. I see it, Lieutenant. That's the enemy. The hot November sun of 1932 beat down on the faces of the two soldiers. They stood beside a Lewis machine gun, waiting for what the Australian government had declared a national threat. That threatening enemy was none other than the emu, a large, flightless bird. Captain, may I speak frankly? Mason asked cautiously. Go ahead, Lieutenant. Don't you think it's a bit ridiculous that we're out here waging war against birds? Mackenzie sighed. He knew how absurd the situation was, but orders were orders. Those birds are destroying all the crops. The farms started by World War I veterans are all at risk. The government has tasked us with solving this problem, and that's what we're going to do. Just then, the dust cloud on the horizon grew larger. A flock of about 50 emus was racing toward them at high speed. Get ready, Lieutenant! Mackenzie shouted. In truth, this bizarre emu war wasn't a simple pest control operation. There was a deeper historical context behind it. In a small cafe on the outskirts of Perth, historian Helen Thomas was telling the story to her young granddaughter, Sarah. Grandma, did Australian soldiers really fight birds and lose? Sarah asked with a look of disbelief. Helen smiled. Yes, it really happened. It was in 1932. It sounds comical now, but it was a very serious problem at the time. She opened an old photo album. Inside were faded black and white photographs. One showed soldiers standing next to a Lewis machine gun, and another showed a flock of emus crossing vast wheat fields. After the First World War ended, many veterans received land in Western Australia from the government. The government hoped they would become farmers and develop Australia's wheat industry. At first, things seemed to be going well. And then, Sarah asked, in 1929, the Great Depression began. Wheat prices plummeted, and the government demanded that veterans grow even more wheat. But right at that moment, the emus appeared? Sarah asked, her eyes widening. Exactly. Thousands of emus, in their breeding season, began migrating from the coast to inland areas, and they discovered the farmers' wheat fields. It was like paradise for the emus. They ate the crops, broke through fences, and contaminated water sources. On November 2, 1932, Captain Mackenzie and Lieutenant Mason engaged in their first battle. As the emu flock approached, Mackenzie shouted, "Fire!" Mason pulled the trigger of the Lewis machine gun. The ear-shattering sound of gunfire echoed across the arid land. But the emus reacted in an unexpected way. Instead of scattering, they divided into small groups and began running in zigzag patterns. Their movements were unpredictable, and their speed was surprisingly fast. "Damn!" Mason exclaimed. "These creatures are using proper tactics." Mackenzie watched in disbelief. "Keep firing!" By the end of that day's battle, the soldiers had taken down only a dozen or so emus. The majority had dodged the bullets and escaped, and some could even continue running after being hit by several bullets. "This is going to be more difficult than we anticipated," Mackenzie muttered. Helen continued telling her granddaughter the story. The veterans were desperate. They asked the government for military assistance, and eventually, the Minister for Defense decided to send troops to solve the emu problem. So Major Gwynn, Captain Mackenzie, and a small unit were dispatched with 2 Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. "But why is it called the Emu War?" Sarah asked. That was because of the media. A journalist called this operation the Emu War, and the name became famous. The Australian military didn't like the name, but it was already too late. Captain Mackenzie glared at Robert Miller, a journalist from the Sydney Morning Herald. "Captain, how is this Emu War progressing?" Miller asked with a slight smirk. "It's not a war, mister." "Miller, we're simply carrying out a pest control operation to reduce crop damage." "I see. And how many of the enemy have you eliminated so far?" Mackenzie gritted his teeth. "We have the situation under control." In reality, they didn't have the situation under control at all. During the first week, they had killed only a few dozen emus. In contrast, thousands of emus continued to attack farms. Even worse, the emus appeared to be learning. They scattered immediately upon seeing soldiers and stayed out of firing range. There even seemed to be emus acting as scouts. When one detected danger, it seemed to warn the others. "These birds are too damn smart," Mason complained. "The emus were truly intelligent," Helen explained. "They stand up to 2 meters tall and can run at 50 kilometers per hour. Moreover, their feathers acted as a kind of bulletproof vest. It was difficult for bullets to penetrate their tough feathers. "Wow, they're super birds!" Sarah exclaimed. That's not all. The emus behaved as if they had collective intelligence. They split into small groups to confuse the soldiers. And there even seemed to be commander emus. Sarah's eyes widened. An emu army? Helen laughed. You could look at it that way. The soldiers became increasingly frustrated. Their tactics weren't working, and ammunition was being rapidly depleted. On November 8th, after a week of failures, Captain Mackenzie decided to try a new strategy. "Lieutenant, we need to change our tactics. Today we're going to try an ambush." They set up the machine gun near a lake where emus frequently gathered. The plan was to surprise them when they came to drink. For hours, they waited under the scorching sun. Finally, a flock of about 100 emus appeared. "Ready," Mackenzie said quietly. "Fire!" Mason pulled the trigger, but the machine gun only made a clicking sound. Damn, the guns jammed. At that sound, the emus immediately responded. They quickly scattered and fled, and the soldiers failed once again. That evening, Mackenzie wrote in his diary with mixed admiration and frustration. The emus appeared to be operating under the directions of an excellent battlefield commander. Their reconnaissance, vigilance, and flanking maneuvers are akin to watching guerrilla warriors. Despite our firepower, we are losing the war against the emus. Helen showed an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Emus triumph over Australian military." Finally, in mid-November, the military discontinued the operation. They had used 10,000 rounds of ammunition, but had killed only about 200 emus. That's about 1 emu per 10 rounds of ammunition. "So the emus won?" Sarah asked. "Yes." The Minister for Defense was ridiculed in Parliament for this failure. One senator even sarcastically suggested that emu medals should be awarded. At the Parliament House in Canberra, Minister for Defense George Pearce stood uncomfortably. "Minister, do you acknowledge that our military has been defeated in a war against birds?" one member asked, trying not to laugh. Pearce gritted his teeth. "We conducted a specialized pest control operation. It was terminated because it was deemed not cost-effective. Did you submit surrender documents to the emus?" Another member shouted, and the chamber erupted in laughter. Pearce's face reddened. "I have determined that this matter no longer requires a military approach. We will shift our policy toward providing farmers with improved fencing systems." In simple terms, they had given up. In December 1932, Captain Mackenzie and Lieutenant Mason sat in a pub in Perth. "You know, Lieutenant," Mackenzie said, taking a sip of beer, "I fought in the World War. I fought against the Germans. But no enemy was as formidable as the emus." Mason laughed. "How will we be recorded in history as soldiers defeated in a war against emuses?" Mackenzie shrugged. "Perhaps no one will remember. It's such a ridiculous story that it might not even make it into the history books." He had no idea how wrong he was. The Emu War would remain one of the most bizarre and interesting episodes in Australian history. Back to modern times at the cafe on the outskirts of Perth. "So how was the emu problem resolved?" Sarah asked. "Eventually, the farmers built better fences and learned to coexist with the emus. A few years later, there was more rainfall, so the emus returned to the coastal areas. But the story of the Emu War became legendary among Australians." Helen showed the final photograph. It was a modern color photo of a flock of emus peacefully grazing near a farm. Today, the emu is one of Australia's proud symbols. It's even on our coat of arms. Perhaps because they won the war. Sarah giggled. "Grandma, that's such a fun story. Can I present it at school?" "Of course, my dear granddaughter. It's also a good lesson about what can happen when we try to control nature. Sometimes it's wiser to adapt than to fight."